Hello and welcome to another video. I was watching a Jordan Peterson video and it's been a while since I've seen one. He was talking to a fellow named Rex about a number of issues, the usual ones that he's covered so far, and he's retelling his story about what he's been through in the last few years and his good experiences and his bad experiences. And one thing that took me by surprise was when he brought up a situation that he has been keeping an eye out for, of how people react when they are bombarded on Twitter or on social media, for example.
One of the things that I have watched quite frequently is the way that people respond to being mobbed on Twitter.
Yeah.
Now I've almost stopped looking at Twitter. It's been about 3 months that I've taken a Twitter hiatus, let's say. I still post, I don't even have my password anymore. I send what I want to post to a third party and they post it because it keeps me out of the...
An antiseptic distance.
That's right, exactly. And that's exactly the right way of thinking about it. People, civilized people, and I mean that in civilized, socialized people, cannot tolerate being mobbed. Because,
no, they can't.
And there's a reason for that. You see, you said, with regards to the British Columbia Human Rights Tribunal, if there's 16 people on one side and one on the other, you might be thinking that the 16 people are right.
More or less.
Right. But then you think of the situation where you've said something on Twitter and, 1,000 people mob you publicly. I mean, your first response is going to be to examine your own conscience and see how you transgressed. It's not really much different psychologically. I mean, it's lesser, I suppose, but it's not that much different than waking up one morning and coming to your door and finding a mob of your neighbors angrily aggregated on your lawn. It's a terrible shock for people, and it really hurts them. They're often, by all accounts, damaged for lengthy periods of time by this, and their first impulse is to apologize, which is truly the wrong thing. Like the right thing to do.
It's stand.
Well, the right thing to do is to understand that if you haven't done anything wrong, you don't apologize. Now that's very difficult. It's very difficult. And then to wait, because if you wait 2 weeks, people will come to your defense.
Yeah, they will.
But it takes the people who will come to your defense 2 weeks to get their act together, where it takes the activists who are unbelievably organized 15 seconds to mob.
And I was quite taken aback because not too long ago there was an incident where a fellow by the name of Wilson Gavin went to a drag queen storytime telling session and protested, yelling out with his colleagues and his friends that drag queens are not for kids.
Drag queens are not for kids. Drag queens are not for kids. Drag queens are not for kids. Very much. Drag queens are not for kids. 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 Drag queens are not for kids.
You do not have permission to film me.
GPS has been pulled.
You used to hold the camera on my face like that indefinitely.
Drag queens are not for kids. 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 Drag.
And I was quite surprised to hear that not long after the protest, 24 hours apparently according to news reports, Gavin Wilson took his own life. Now Jordan Peterson hit it right on the head, and that's why I want to make this video today, just to share what he had to say about it and the implications that we are seeing and the power that social media has to influence people. And my suspicions were confirmed, and I must admit that I dislike and hate to quote news.com, but I'm going to do it for this video anyway. And it says here, describing the issue, that Gavin was very much, Mr. Gavin, was very much a good man, a person that Jordan Peterson describes in his video. There was an outpour of support and affection shown for the man. and it's quite sad to see how this turned out. His friend's name is Drew Pavlow. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, but he said this: away from the social media storms and headlines, he was at his core a very decent and kind person that cared for others. But as news.com says here, that didn't seem to matter to the people. It says that the Twitter mob responded so quickly and with such intensity that pausing to consider some of those other factors like his young age or potential frame of mind didn't happen. And then news.com goes in to describe people who have actually researched this phenomenon and shown what happens with this new culture that we have, where we cancel people, where we pile on them for their political opinions that may be deemed inappropriate or unacceptable. I'll read this section called Dangers of Mob Rule. Public shaming is not a new phenomenon by any stretch, but as Russell Blackford, a writer, philosopher, and lecturer at the University of Newcastle explained, civilizations moved away from it, partly in recognition of its cruelty. The explosion and growth of social media platforms over the past decade has seen its return, but Dr. Blackford describes it as a very new form of shaming. These types of mobs are just devastating for people, and I don't think those who participate in them fully understand just how destructive they can be, Dr. Blackford said. And we have to assume that is due in part to the anonymity that people have online. If you tell a person to their face exactly what you think, you can see and hear and observe their response. But on social media, you're able to dump a comment that is nasty, cruel, or rude with no consequence. And it is a serious problem. That disconnect between people allows this to happen. He goes on to say, one of the things that worries me is the sheer glee and cruelty that can be shown by these mobs when they're out to destroy people. There have been countless examples of Twitter mobs canceling or deplatforming those who commit some kind of moral indiscretion. He examined a number of incidents for his book, The Tyranny of Opinion, and said the consequences can be significant. With social media, the whole world opens up and you can find yourself piled on by huge numbers of people, often with threats. It's a significant storm. It's often massively disproportionate to the original incident. Any second chance someone comes much, much later. But that aside, there can be a sheer psychological impact that can make any redemption almost beside the point. I'm actually surprised more people haven't died by suicide over these kinds of things. People have lost their jobs. There have been devastating effects on families, and on it goes. Now, I wanted to share the video from Game of Thrones of the woman who's walking through the streets and getting taunted, ridiculed, spat upon, harassed by supposedly her fellow citizens or her fellow people. She makes them march through them, and they shout their vitriol at her for the crimes and sins that she has committed. Primarily, I'd imagine from people who are full of their own indiscretions themselves. And I think this is something that we need to consider when we hear or observe someone with a different opinion to our own. In particular, someone with an opinion like Mr. Gavin, who feels so strongly that drag queens have no place in public libraries reading to children. And he had the strength to rally his friends together, men and women, many of them young, most of them young actually, to protest and to rally. They came together to speak their minds and to say what they had to say. And I think they all should feel proud for their bravery and going against the grain. Because, as we've seen from the incident, in the situation with Mr. Gavin, that opinion is not acceptable to many in society. And that if you have that opinion, if you voice that opinion, you will suffer the consequences, as he has done. Now, Jordan Peterson mentioned something that I think is quite poignant to all this. He said that it takes at least 2 weeks for anyone else who has an opinion that might be in line with Mr. Gavin's to respond, whereas those, I would assume on the left, are ready and cocked and loaded to fire. And we can see in the space of 24 hours, Mr. Gavin was heaped upon and piled upon. So I think we really need to consider how we are doing in society at the moment with our political discussions. And I think this is a major turning point, in my view, around politics and debate, because we have the right, or I would say the center. These people are centrists in my view. These young people who are sharing their views. We have to consider what we are going to do moving forward. These people have used the same tactics that the left uses: protesting and disrupting, and it's clear that they don't like a taste of their own medicine. So we'll see how things pan out in the future, but I just think it's very, very interesting to hear what Jordan Peterson has to say. He's been going through a rough time at the moment, and back in November, he articulated things that we can actually see play out in real life. We saw someone get heaped upon and piled upon, who faced the mob, who was a good person. He was devastated by the response he had on social media. And it's quite sad to see. So I think the lesson in all this, especially for the young liberals out there, I would say be proud of who you are and the stand that you took against drag queens reading to kids. Don't be turned away or don't be silenced, because you have every right to speak and say what you have to say and want to say as anyone else. And unfortunately, I think your voice that you have been able to share, far too many are silent, and far too many fail to get your back. But we shall see how things move forward in the future. That's it for today. Love to hear what you think in the comments. Speak soon. Bye-bye now.